You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. And my guest today is Reber. We're going to be talking about origins of mind and cellular consciousness. This should be a super interesting call. So, Arthur, thanks for coming.
Okay, glad to be here.
Yeah. So, are most people aware there is such a thing as cellular consciousness? And how did you get into this area of study?
Well, it actually goes back some time. This idea started brewing in my head, I guess somewhere in the early 90s. I wrote a book on unconscious learning. It's called Implicit Learning, like human intuition. And I kind of sort of couldn't bite the bullet. I couldn't bring myself to think that an individual cell, a unicellular organism, really could be conscious. And part of the problem was that, I'm a cognitive psychologist and we study human cognitive functions. And so we tend to be kind of focused on human consciousness. And that just seems so remote, so different from anything that could take place in a single cell organism. So I kind of shoved the idea. And in fact, in the 93 book, I actually had a paragraph where I discussed the issue. And I, as they say in games like backgammon, you decline the option. And so I just, said, no, I'm not going to go down that road. It's a bridge too far. And then about a year or two after that, I had this kind of strange epiphany. I was in the garden and I had planted some basil plants. And I was taking a look, checking them out, and there was this caterpillar gnawing away at my precious plants. Actually, I don't garden anymore. I watch my wife garden. She's very good. She's a superb gardener. And so I'm looking at this caterpillar that normally most people would think of as kind of a robotic entity that doesn't have sentience or any kind of subjective life. And that just seemed wrong. It just seemed wrong. The more I looked at it, the more it just seemed to be thinking, to be processing information. If it was a robotic-like, entity, it would be doing the same thing over and over again. But it wasn't. It varied its act, as it were, depending upon circumstances. It was like it was making choices. Which leaf to chew on? Should I check for predators now? So I sort of hatched this idea, and I called it Caterpillars in Consciousness. And then the British Psychological Society invited me to come and give one of the keynote addresses at their annual meeting. And I did. And I said, look, this is the perfect time to do this, because what better audience is there than a muster of British academics, full of haranguing and table pounding and snarky questions and so forth, challenging my sanity. So I gave the talk, and the strangest thing happened. Everybody got up and walked out. I turned to the moderator and I said, did I offend them? What happened? She said, no. We had a dust-up last year over one of the keynote speakers, and it turned out so emotionally distressing that we decided if we had a dicey topic, we were not going to allow questions. So I felt like I was completely, snookered on this. I didn't get what I wanted. So then I sort of did the obvious thing, which is you write it up and you send it to a journal. So I wrote the paper up. I sent it to a journal, Philosophical Psychology, and I'm on the editorial board. So they were very nice. They accepted the article. And in it, I outlined, the basic notion that individual cells, can in fact be conscious. And when it comes to caterpillars, it's perfectly obvious. And it fell on the same kind of deaf ears. Nobody referred to it. No, nobody cited it. And I figured, all right, the world's not ready for this issue. So I shoved it on the back burner again.
Do you think it would have been easier to start, let's say, with dogs, and then to work your way down in terms of the apparent complexity to us of the organisms, to get to the
No,
caterpillar and then to the cell instead of jumping to the cell?
no, and I'll tell you why. Because when I actually sat down to write this book, and started really digging through the literature, I discovered that that approach has been tried, and it's been tried in the obvious ways, which is you start out looking at human consciousness and you try to log the things that we do, the cognitive functions that we have, the behaviors we engage in, the memory systems, our affect, and you sort of log those and get a good sense of what the human, conscious experience is. And then you try and find the underlying neurological foundations of this. What brain centers, what brain pathways, what areas in the brain are responsible for these kinds of actions, behaviors, thoughts, and cognitions. And then you start working your way back down the evolutionary tree. And you're looking for either the behaviors that look like they could be the precursors of our cognitive functions, or you look for the neurological brain structures that look like they could be the analogs of human brain structures. And so you're looking for the place along the evolutionary tree where you can identify what looks like it began here. And the interesting thing is, when you look at this research, you find that every researcher that's done this finds consciousness in the species that they specialize in. So the specialists who deal with avian psychology, they're convinced that birds, especially corvids, crows and ravens, they have a legitimate consciousness. If you look at the entomologists who study insects, and there's a well-known fellow named Carol Tenkate who studies bees, and his research with bees is brilliant, and he's absolutely convinced that consciousness begins with insects.
A lot of people start with the anthropomorphic view, but then you said even when someone studies another creature, they start with the view based on that creature. You
Yep.
said insect researchers think, okay, that's where it begins, and birds,
Yep.
that's where it begins. Makes sense.
Right. So the fun part of that is it's everywhere, and it's where you look. And of course, if you're a specialist in one area or another, that's where you look. So, for example, you get other people like McPhail, Ian McPhail. He's a linguist, and he's convinced that consciousness is not possible without language. So he won't give any species credit for having a genuine, mind, unless they're part of the linguistic species, which right now that's basically us. So you get these funny kinds of discoordinations. Now, all of these people are confronted with what's basically known as the emergentist's dilemma, the emergentist problem. They have to explain why, when you get a brain like a bumblebee, this bumblebee is conscious, has consciousness, but the species that preceded it, that were simpler, didn't. What happened in evolution that suddenly, bingo, consciousness springs into existence where just, one geological, one cosmic moment earlier, it wasn't there?
I even spoke to a guy today, a scientist, and we were talking about humans. And I said, well, someone sleeping conscious is a baby that's in a certain stage of fetal development conscious, and when does it magically turn on? If so,
yes, but you see, of course, the human is conscious, and there are going to be suspension states, or there are sleep states. I mean, one of the questions that comes up when you start talking about cell biologists is, does a single-celled organism sleep? Do bacteria sleep? Well, it turns out that they don't sleep like we sleep, or like a cat sleeps, but they do have down periods where the metabolic functions drop, and it's almost as if it's a period for recovery, for biomechanical recovery. So the more I looked at this, the more it seemed almost impossible to play this looking backward game to identify the origins of consciousness. And the reason is because it was there all along. The reason everybody finds it in whatever species that they decide to look at is because it's been there from the very beginning. And now you start reading cell biology. And this took me into a whole other realm that I had never looked at in my life. And what you find is cell biologists have for decades, sometimes many decades, been perfectly comfortable with the notion that cells are conscious. And in fact, Lynn Margulis, one of the great cell biologists of the century, wrote a paper called "The Conscious Cell." And I mean, it's like it didn't even need any further argument or explanation. It was just obvious that cells were conscious. So you start looking through this literature, and what you discover is that bacteria, prokaryotes, the simplest living organisms on the planet, they have astonishing skills. They learn. They can learn patterns. There's this wonderful experiment where they have, a petri dish and it's full of bacteria, and they feed it lactose, which is the sugar that they really like, and they slurp it up, and then they stop, take a short break, and then they put a concentrated maltose solution in. Now, maltose is another sugar, and they also absorb that, but they don't like it as much. And in order to get maximum benefit from it, they have to adjust their nutritive functions. They have to adjust the way their biomedical metabolic functions to maximally absorb it. So now you repeat the process: lactose, maltose, lactose, maltose, lactose, maltose. And what you find is you give them lactose, you remove it, and they immediately begin to anticipate the maltose by changing their underlying nutrient functions. And you now fool them by giving them a second dose of lactose. They have trouble uptaking it because they've already made the adjustment to anticipate the new one. So they're learning a pattern, and this is astonishing.
Are there any evidence of microsalivations from the bacteria? I'm just teasing. But
they can excrete waste matter, but no, they don't. There's no salivary anticipation. No, I don't think we're going to get Pavlovian salivary response from a bacterium, but you can certainly get this anticipatory reaction. By the way, they also communicate with each other, and they communicate by releasing compounds that have a dramatic impact. So one of the things that bacteria are really good at is clumping together and forming mats. Call them microbial mats. Problem with microbial mat is when it starts getting large, is that the bacteria in the interior, in the center, they start getting into nutritive deficits because the food stuff is in the periphery that surrounds the mat. So the bacteria on the edge, they're in good shape in terms of nutrients, but they also have a problem because the predators are out there, the toxins are out there, the viruses are out there. And so they have to protect themselves. So while they enjoy the extra food, they have this other dangerous component in the environment. Bacteria on the interior have the opposite circumstance. There's less food for them, but they're protected. If the nutrient balance gets so low that they now begin to basically, be in real nutritive deficit, they will send out molecules to communicate by sending information across the mat to their brethren and sisterin, they don't have genders, to their fellow bacteria on the periphery, that basically says, hey, slow down. Stop reproducing. Stop gobbling up all the damn food. We're really having a tough time in here. And they do. And now the food flows into the interior of the mat. The cells in the center now recover from their nutritive deficits. Now they send out another signal that says, we're fine now. And the guys on the periphery, now they begin reproducing and they begin, scarfing up the food at the rate they were before.
Quick question there. I wonder if the analog in embryology happens, the cell-to-cell communication. Let's say you're forming the liver of a person. This makes me think that there would be cell-to-cell communication, just like in a biofilm, of where to stop and how to shape the liver and how far to go.
There's absolutely no doubt about this. Absolutely not. All of the cells of the body are communicating with each other in a whole series of complex ways. But let's go back to the biofilm for a second, because there's a point I want to make.
Sorry.
It's kind of subtle, but what this is altruism. This is a primitive form of altruism because the cells on the periphery are putting themselves at risk by slowing down their absorption of food products, by stopping or slowing down cell division rates. They're putting their DNA at risk, which is a classic, base point where the people who argue about the genetic basis of altruism happens to be. It's you're putting yourself at risk. You're putting your DNA at risk. This is, Dawkins' selfish gene notion. But you see this behavior in bacteria. And not only do you see it within a colony, you see it across colonies. They have two biofilm that have been set up, and they're in a petri dish where they can communicate with each other. And now they control the nutritive concentrations so that they put one colony in nutritive deficit, but they have an abundance for the other colony. The colony that is in a deficit state will send out now a slightly different molecule because it now has to travel across the medium, but it's the same basic principle, which is, hey, we're in trouble over here. You guys, can you slow down a little bit? And they do. And the other colony makes adjustments in its biological functions until the first colony says, okay, we're fine. So this happens across bacterial species as well. So I think this stuff is fascinating. So the more you look at this stuff, the more you look at the fact that bacteria they can learn patterns, they can communicate with each other, they have memories, they form memories that can last up to 2 hours, which is an eternity in a bacterium's life. And you realize they've got to be conscious. They have to have subjectivity. They have to have an experiential, phenomenal state. There is something it is like to be a bacterium. There's nothing it's like to be a toaster, but there's something it's like to be a bacterium. So that's where consciousness begins.
A couple of quick questions about this. We'll get on to in a second. I wanted to ask you about viruses and phages and prions and stuff like that. But before we get to that, have scientists observed a hierarchy in the biofilm? Like who is running the show on the biofilm and how decisions get made? Is it completely collectively, or is there, again, a hierarchy of cells, like in an ant colony or a bee colony? Is there a queen?
Yeah. No, it doesn't seem to have anything like that. They do engage in quorum sensing, and that is a way in which they can judge the size of the colony, and they can make adjustments in it. But it appears as though, as far as I can tell, cell biologists may know more about this certainly than I do, but it appears as if each of the individuals is acting as an individual. But what you're hinting at, or what you're making me think about, is one of the really big problems in cell biology, which is how do you get a multicellular organism? Multicellular organisms develop from, evolve from individual organisms, individual cells that have their own internal representational system. But when you get a multicellular species, what happens is it has a singular experience. Those bumblebees that 10K studies, those bumblebees have millions and millions of cells. Each of them has its own representational system, but they all collaborate and coordinate to produce a singular, phenomenal experience that the bumblebee has, just like you and I do. Our trillions of cells in our body are all doing their thing, but somehow or other it all gets coordinated and collected together to give us a singular conscious experience. And this is a struggle.
And at what point does that happen? How many cells make that happen?
I think it happens at the point at which multicellularity is solved. See, multicellularity is a problem, and it took evolution a long time to work it out. It took over 1 billion years because for the longest time there was nothing but single-cell species. There was nothing but prokaryotes and archaea. And at a time just before the Cambrian explosion, where there was this huge, explosion's the only word for it. Just so many species emerged, beginning at about 540 million years ago, and over the first 60 million years of the Cambrian, and this astonishing array of species emerged. And in fact, virtually all of the clades that exist now. Their roots go back to that period. And this happened. There's a lot of speculation about why this happened. There are a couple of Israeli psychologists that have written a lovely book called The Sensitive Soul. And their argument is that at the beginning of the Cambrian, they discovered a kind of learning mechanism, which they call universal associative learning. And they argue that this learning mechanism is what gave rise to consciousness. But what was happening at the exact same time was the discovery of the solution, the emergence of multicellularity. And once you have a multicellular species, the avenues of evolution that open up are myriad. There are just so many more paths that you can go down to produce new and different kinds of species. I don't think that there was any new learning that took place. I think this kind of associative learning existed in bacteria as well. I think what happened is the multicellularity issue was solved. And biologists are working like hell trying to figure out what the underlying mechanism is. They don't know. But that's okay. We don't know a lot of things.
Quick question here. Bacteria are single cells, but when they form a biofilm, do you think that they then form a collective experience that resembles what a multicellular creature experiences?
I don't think they do until they develop linkages between the cells. And one of the other issues that comes up here is the development of neural tissue. Because when you have neurons, you can do a lot of things you couldn't do before you had neurons. For example, they're fast, for one, and much faster than the way information can be transmitted through a colony of individual bacteria. So when that happens, things begin to change. But in my mind, what we're looking at, the type token distinction in philosophy, you refer to things as types. Individual types. A type is an entity that can be identified and distinguished from some other type. So we have types. We have books, and books are different from toasters. But within the type of things called books, we have lots of different kinds of books, and they're different tokens. So you have a variety of different tokens, each one of which is a book and is classified under the same type book. Similar with toasters, but there's no overlap between the types of toasters and the types of books. Here's the point. When people talk about consciousness emerging at different points in time, in different species, they're talking about different types. They're saying the type of consciousness that a bee has is different from the type of consciousness that a frog has. And I'm saying no. They are different tokens of a singular underlying type. And the type, we're going to call it by the most generic name around, sentience. They are sentient creatures. All sentient creatures share some things. They share a self-awareness, the capacity to distinguish thee from me, the ability to have internal subjective senses, to have affect, to judge good things from bad things. And these are the core functions that make up sentience. And which you see over evolution, which you see over the hundreds of millions of years and billions of years of evolution, is the emergence of a wide myriad of tokens, each of which expresses this fundamental sentience in a different way. So that's my basic argument.
Would you say that bacteria then are sentient?
Yep, absolutely. When you look at the various theories that people have put forward about consciousness, philosophers have put them forward, artificial intelligence researchers have put them forward, cognitive psychologists, neuroscientists. They tend to look at cognitive functions. They tend to look at learning. I told you about that book by Ginsberg and Jablonka. Their whole theory is hoisted on the scaffolding of this universal associative learning mechanism. So they talk about memory, they talk about learning, they talk about decision making. They talk about the kinds of things that cognitive psychologists like to talk about, particularly when they talk about human functions. But that's not where it begins. It begins with affect. It begins with emotion. It begins with feeling. Bacteria have feelings. They can detect temperature gradients. And they detect that they have swum into an environment that's too cold. They don't like it. It feels uncomfortable to them. they will take their little, flagella rotors and shift the direction in which they rotate, and they will back out, and they will return to the environment they were in before. Now, this is important because they remember where they were before. They know not to go forward, but to go back. And so they will return to a place that's more comfortable. If you put one of them in contact with a salt molecule, which they find really aversive, they will retreat. They will move away from it. If you put them in graded concentrations of food nutrients, where they can detect that as they move forward, they get a greater concentration of nutrients, they will continue to move forward.
A couple of experiments here, I think that maybe they have been done or they should be done. What if you expose a few bacteria to salt and sensitize them to it, like expose them a bunch of times, and then put them back with a colony of other bacteria, and then they form a biofilm, and then you tested to see the sensitivity of the biofilm, maybe like the bacteria that were salt punished are on the right side of the biofilm, and you put salt on the left side of the biofilm and see if it reacts differently than a biofilm that doesn't have cells that were primed in this way. Has that been done?
That's brilliant. I love that. I don't know if it's been done. I haven't seen it. I do know that they have done experiments where they will flood a colony with an unpleasant salt solution. And what happens is, because they haven't done it in the way that you've described, the ones that I know about, they flood the entire colony with a salt solution. And what you get is they make a metabolic adjustment that enables them to withstand the concentrated salt solution without dying. Basically, they learn to reduce the death rate from the solution. Now, this particular species that they worked with, it's what's called a sessile lifestyle, which is they put down a foot pad on a piece of detritus and they stay there. They don't swim around. But when they divide, the daughter cells swim away and they go off to another part of the environment, and they establish their own spot to live in. And now, if you reintroduce the salt solution, the mother cells, they don't die at a high rate because they remember the previous experience with the concentrated salt solution, and they can make immediate adjustments in their metabolism to protect them from it. But the daughter cells, they don't have the memory any longer, and there's no need to hold on to the memory because they've gone to a new location, which, as so far as they know, and I know using the word "know" for a bacterium is weird, but as far as they know, no salt solutions are coming their way. So they die at a very high rate, but the mother cells survive. So we know that they can make these kinds of metabolic adjustments, and we know they can hold on to this memory for up to 2 hours, which is, again, remarkable. But whether or not they could communicate this information across the colony, that's fascinating.
It's just a feeling, but I have the distinct feeling that in a biofilm, let's say, you have the bacteria that are on the outside of it and on the inside of it, and they essentially are changing their, I don't know to what extent they're changing, but they're changing. They're changing, let's say, their DNA or other cellular structures, internal structures to respond to this outside stimuli. So they're becoming different bacteria in a way. So I would think that there has to be a hierarchy, even in a biofilm, that temporarily there would be established one. So here's another experiment that I just thought of. Maybe this would elucidate it. So is there a molecule, and I'm sure there is, that fools a bacteria? A bacteria may think it's food. Then when it takes it in, it actually poisons it and kills it. So what if you had such a molecule and you exposed some bacteria to it and some of them survived, they had the memory of this. Then again, put them into a biofilm and they were on the right side and the left side, you now exposed to this molecule that would trick them and hurt them when they internalized it. Could the colony communicate fast enough to avoid it?
Well, again, there's a variation on the same basic idea, but those molecules are called antibiotics, and we know that they can react to antibiotics by making adaptations in their DNA over generations, because that's how you get bacterial resistance to antibiotics. Bacteria are very good at changing their DNA. You know what the CRISPR technique is, right?
A bit, yeah.
Okay, so you know who invented CRISPR? Bacteria. Yes, they're the ones that invented CRISPR. They're the ones that figured out how to take a snippet of the virus that's invaded and use it to modify their own DNA to protect themselves, to develop an immune reaction which will defeat the virus. And it was people like Jennifer Doudna at Berkeley who will, I predict, win the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine soon, she and her collaborator. Um, and they're the ones that discovered it, figured out how to um, take snippets of using the CRISPR techniques, take snippets of DNA from any arbitrary cell and modify it, change it around. Which, of course, has led to this recent flurry about the physician in China who used the CRISPR technique to modify the cells of a fertilized egg
Right.
of an embryo. He's been severely chastised for this because there's an international moratorium on doing this because it's very, very tricky stuff, very deep, important ethical issues that are involved in it because the technique is so strong that you can
Right.
you can literally get designer babies using it. But that's another topic.
Okay.
Well, I mean, do you have a specific topic? Because I was going to raise one that you haven't asked that I suspect listeners might be intrigued by. Our
I did.
plant
I just wanted to ask you briefly, if you could hold it in your mind, I want to ask you briefly about viruses and phages and prions. And, they're even supposedly simpler than bacteria, but they
Yep.
seem to have collective behavior. They seem to have signaling amongst them. So are they sentient, and why or why not?
I am agnostic on viruses. I'm willing to have my mind made up by the data, but I honestly do not know. My fundamental axiom is that life and sentience are coterminous. As soon as you have life, you have this sentient experience. When the organism dies, it goes away. And the notion that you could have a living thing without this kind of internal, subjective, experiential state, to me makes no sense. The environment is in constant flux. Temperatures are changing, light levels are changing, nutrient levels are changing. The nature of local predators and toxins are constantly changing. It just doesn't make sense to me to think that an organism could survive that kind of environmental chaos if all it had were, DNA programmed robotic responses, because that would mean you'd have to have a different one that evolved for each of the individual functions that the species can display. And this is crazy. It makes no sense from an evolutionary biological point of view. The thing that makes sense is you have this singular underlying, that's called a mental state, a mental representation. As soon as you get that, you now can, and this is the key, differentiate good from bad. You can differentiate too hot from just right. You can differentiate toxin from nutritious molecule. And as long as you can make these affective decisions and judgments, you have an internal state, you have internal representation, and now you're on your way to becoming a human being. It's going to take you a long time, but you're now on your way. And if you didn't have these underlying, subjective states, I don't see how you can get evolution. I've argued with this with Dan Dennett. Dan's, he's probably the most important philosopher alive, and we've been friends for over 30 years. And there's a long section in the book, The First Minds, criticizing Dan's work. And I sent it to him. I said, "Have I got you right?" And he said, "Yes, you do." And I said, "Why don't you agree with me?" And he said, "I just don't agree with you." He said, "I think you're wrong. I think all of these early behaviors that you're describing are all handled by this robotic mechanism, and they don't have any sentience or consciousness." So we've agreed to disagree, and there that is.
Well, if cells are conscious and they're sentient, where is the sentience? You take apart a bacteria, we're back to what happened over the past several thousand years, and especially the recent few hundred years. Where is life? Where does life come from? Where does it reside in an organism? Where does consciousness reside? Where is it?
Well, I think the bacterium is experienced as a singular affective state entirely by the whole organism. Now, but there are ways to answer that question. Like, for example, if we begin understanding what aspects of the DNA code are giving rise to this kind of experiential sense, then we can use CRISPR techniques to go in and remove those snip out the pieces of DNA that look like they're coding for the gene that produces this kind of sentience. And if we've got it, then the organism should become unconscious and probably would die. And so, in principle, you'll be able to find these things encoded in the DNA by using the CRISPR technique. But the question about what gives rise to this, my friend František Beluška, he's at the University of Bonn in Germany, and we began corresponding, a year or so ago. And we got together in Montreal last summer, and we began collaborating. And the first paper came out just a month or two ago in the journal Bioessays. And in it, we make this fundamental argument about the coterminous nature of life and sentience. And at the same time, we try to identify candidates, what the possible biomechanical, physiological mechanisms could be that would produce sentience. And they're all built around the notion of irritability of membranes. Membrane irritability is known to be a critical element in the life of single-cell species of prokaryotes. And it has to do with the kinds of changes that take place when objects, molecules, make contact with the outer membrane of the bacterium. And so we've got a couple of them. František he's the cell biologist on that. I'm not. And hopefully they're subject to empirical investigation, because each of them has fairly specific aspects of membrane excitability that should be there if it is one of the mechanisms. There could be more than one mechanism operating. We honestly really just don't know yet.
Yeah, because life acts in a fundamentally different way than non-life at every level, it appears.
Yes, absolutely. A couple of really interesting elements here we haven't gotten to. Let me introduce. I'll just give you the words, and you can pick the one you'd like to talk about. One word is anesthetics. The other word is plants.
Okay.
You choose.
I guess both sound interesting. Maybe start with anesthetics, and maybe you can talk a little bit about plants after that.
Sure. See, one of the interesting things is bacteria are sensitive to anesthetics. They desensitize them, just like they do with you and me. It's like they do with every mammal and virtually every species on the planet.
Wow.
Why would a bacterium be sensitive to anesthetics if it didn't have experience, if it didn't have painful experiences that the anesthetic would operate in a way to minimize, let's just put it in Buddhist terms, minimize suffering? It doesn't make any sense. So the very fact
that bacteria that are anesthetized, but how does it behave?
They go to sleep. Their overall functions are compromised, just like any other species.
Wow.
Some species of bacteria actually produce their own anesthetics, and that's what leads you to plants. Plants do the same thing. Most of the anesthetics that we have come from plants. Opium. Why would plants produce anesthetics if they didn't have experiences? Now, in the first minds, I was agnostic on plants. I discussed them at some length, and I frankly couldn't make up my mind. But I wrote that section before I met František. And František and his friends and a couple of other biologists, Paco Cabo, for example, at the University in Spain, has also been collecting some very impressive data from plants that makes me think that, in fact, plants are probably sentient also. We tend not to think about them as being sentient, and I think one of the reasons is we think they don't move, they don't locomote, they have rigid cell walls, they put down roots and they stay there. But as Paco pointed out to me in an email exchange, plants do move. They just move slowly. They send out tendrils that are sensitive to pressure from objects that they come in contact with. The roots that are sent out underground are sensitive to nutrient contents and will shift in different ways depending upon the circumstances, the environment in the soil. So I asked František, I said, well, look, if this is true, and it probably is. I'm at the point where I'm saying it probably is. Ethical vegans are in trouble. What are they going to do?
Yeah.
And as I said, I asked František this, and he laughed, and he said, they will eat the plants that want to be eaten. And there are. The plants that want to be eaten are those that propagate by having the species that eats them have them pass through their alimentary canal and deposit the seeds someplace else, which maximizes the range of their DNA. So those are the ones, and they're the ones that taste good also, because they made them taste good because that's the way in which they maximize their distribution.
Yeah.
See, here's what. Yeah, but let me sort of engage in a little evolutionary biology with you, because there's an important issue here that has to be confronted. And frankly, I haven't seen anyone confront this before I did in my book. Evolution has a hierarchical feature to it. It's based upon a simple notion that if we discover something that works, we're going to keep it. It's going to become part of the foundation upon which later evolving species will be built. So, for example, once you get a vertebrae, and you get the order vertebrata, it never goes away. You never give it up. There's one species that seems to have given up its spine, and it's the hagfish. And the researcher who did the final analysis that showed that in fact it did almost certainly give up its spine, called it a case of spectacular degeneration. So this principle holds, and it's a problem for people like me and my theory, which I call, by the way, the cellular basis of consciousness, or the CBC theory. If you believe, as I do, if the argument is solid, that sentience occurred with the very beginnings of life, and it's a highly adaptive, an essential function of life. Plants evolved long after these prokaryotes appeared on the planet. Plants evolved because a eukaryote, which is the simplest eukaryotes are single-cell organisms. In a sense, they're single-cell. In some senses, they're multicellular. But it incorporated a cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria is a species that use photosynthesis, and it retained the rigid cell wall. And this chimera, this brand new species, was the first plant. It was an algae. And all the plants on the planet are evolved from that single occurrence. Now, if the eukaryote and that prokaryote were both sentient, then the end product, the chimera, would have been sentient as well, because you don't give it up. So from that perspective, all plants should be sentient in some sense.
One example of this that jumps out at me is, I was reading Evolutionary by, I forget his name, Frank something, but he talked about the hummingbird and the plants that it feeds from, that it gets its nectar from, and the shape of the opening in the plant is perfectly mirrored to the beak of the hummingbird.
Yes.
It's just long enough so when the hummingbird feeds off the nectar, the pollen goes at the right spot. I mean, how did that happen?
Well, because what happens is, here's this little flower, and it's kind of okay. These hummingbirds have been hanging around eating other things, but it would really be neat if they would pollinate me. And so you get natural selection kicks in. You get natural variations in the shape of this sort of like trumpet-like affair of the flower. And some of them are more attractive to hummingbirds than others are. And so they're the ones that are going to be more likely to be fertilized, and therefore more likely to have their genes in the next generation. And then over time, these things, come together. It's also likely the case that it went the other way, that individual variation in hummingbird beak and texture and shape of the tongue was better adapted to certain flowers than others. And say there's a flower that's particularly good in nectar. And so the hummingbirds whose beaks and tongues match this more efficiently than their brethren who have slightly different shape to the beak and the tongue. But they're going to have an advantage in their DNA, and these things will accumulate over multiple generations.
But now we're back to neo-Darwinism. I mean, what? This is again just pure speculation, but I think the plant, through its senses, literally probably had to see the hummingbird and had to feel it. How would it know just by the tip of its beak? Let's say it had a very shallow area where the nectar was. How would the plant know just from the tip of the beak of the hummingbird that it should extend downward? How would it know without tactile response, without maybe visual, without some kind of chemical evaluation? How would it even know to evaluate this thing and evolve along with it?
You're bringing in epigenetic factors here, where the way in which the plant grows and develops over time has an impact on its own DNA. It's kind of interesting because epigenetics factors have reinvigorated Lamarckianism. And there's probably some component that's there. But remember, these things take a bloody long time. I mean, it takes millions of years for the hummingbirds and the flowers, to get together, so that what we end up looking at now looks, hey, that's kind of neat. How did that happen? Well, it took a damn long time for it to happen. See, these things, it's really funny. People tend to forget how long geological time actually is. I mean, the Earth was basically formed in its current state about 4 billion years ago, but life didn't occur for probably took 500 million years, maybe closer to 1 billion. So aliens could have come down, take a look, and say, oh, no, nothing's happening here, climb in their ships and go away. They wait 1,000 years, which with the common era is only 2,000 years old, right? They would come back in 1,000 years, they take a look, oh, still nothing happening. Then they come back in another 1,000, nothing's happening. They come back 1 million of these 1,000s, 1 million of them, and they go, oh, look, finally, there's a prokaryote, right? It took a long time for it to happen, and there's a whole field of research called Origins of Life, and they meet on a regular basis. They have conferences. They have journals that they publish in. And what these are biophysicists and evolutionary biologists that are looking for the actual real-life mechanisms that took place during this extended period of time that gave rise to life. And what they're discovering is there's shortcuts. And this is really interesting stuff. They're just beginning to crack, the code on these things. One of the arguments, that goes back to the creationists, is that, it's called the blind watchmaker argument. So you walk along a beach and there's a watch, and you pick it up. You go, somebody made this. This did not just happen here by accident. And so the argument is, you look at life, you look at human beings. Somebody made them. The creator had to have made them. You'd never get this by chance alone. But it turns out that there are shortcuts where you get certain molecular compounds, proteins that they come together by chance, in mid-ocean rifts probably, and then a drop of magnesium shows up, or potassium or something. I don't remember the details on these, and suddenly you get the precursor for RNA. Suddenly you get molecules that look like they could be used as the basis for getting RNA. And they're pretty sure that RNA preceded DNA. I mean, that seems fairly clear. And so these shortcuts, if they can discover enough of them, and then you can introduce them in an artificial laboratory environment, you ought to be able to produce eventually a prokaryote, a genuine living organism. That's a couple of decades down the road. But the interesting research, I think, is in finding these biomechanical shortcuts, because otherwise the problem really looks almost unsurmountable. Just looks too complex, too difficult. I talked earlier about this emergentist dilemma, that the people who think that consciousness first shows up in insects, they have to explain what the underlying biomechanical and evolutionary mechanisms are that that makes it emerge at this point. I have an emergent dilemma myself, but my emergent dilemma, I think, is easier to resolve than the others, because the others are all derived from what David Chalmers infamously called the hard problem, which is how does the brain make the mind? They're merely rephrasing it. How does the bee's brain make the mind? Or how does a cuttlefish's brain make the cuttlefish mind? And if you answer for the cuttlefish, it's not going to do any good for the bee. But if you answer for the prokaryote, it's good for everybody. It handles everything that evolves from that point on.
So, Arthur, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and to read your books and to take this further?
Okay, well, the book is called The First Minds, Caterpillars, Karyotes, and Consciousness. It came out a couple of months ago. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's available at all of the obvious places. That is, Oxford University Press's website has it. Amazon has it. Barnes & Noble has it. Your local bookstore, if it's an academic bookstore, might have it. It's not written for academics. It's written for that cliched cohort, the intelligent layperson, and it's written for that group of individuals with an effort to maintain sufficient scientific clarity and foundation so that I don't embarrass myself in front of cell biologists or neuroscientists.
Well, very good, Arthur. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation. I had a wonderful time.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.